He'd been living up in the mountains for nearly 20 years. Folks in town had stopped saying his name. No one remembered his face anymore. Only the stray dogs sometimes ran toward the trees like they still remembered the man who once led them through the worst winter. Then one morning he showed up quiet, worn and wordless, on the edge of a dusty auction block. Not as a seller, but as the one being sold, no protest, no defense. Just a stillness in his weathered hands that said, "I've seen worse." She came from the other side, a pregnant widow holding the hands of two children. She wasn't looking for a husband, only a name on paper. Anyone to help her keep the deed to her late husband's ranch. No one blinked when she offered $1, but what no one expected was what happened next. The moment the paper exchanged hands, the mountain man lifted his head, looked her right in the eyes and said her name. Not the one she'd given that day, not the one the townsfolk knew, but the old one, soft, sacred. The name only one person in the world had ever called her. Where had they met before? Why did he know her true name? And what happens when two broken people enter a deal and find something real instead? Step into a story of quiet redemption, where names carry memory and love doesn't shout. It waits, watches, and simply shows up. When was the last time someone truly remembered you? Shall we keep going? The auction wasn't crowded that morning, just a few dusty men with worn boots and a thin wind that carried the scent of wood smoke and resignation. Nobody clapped. Nobody joked. The ones who came knew it wasn't really about buying or selling, it was about getting rid of what no longer served them. Clara Mae Dillard, 35, kept one hand on the shoulder of her son Evan and the other on the back of her daughter Noli. The girl clutched a cloth doll missing an eye. The boy kept his mouth set, watching everything like he was twice his age. They were too young to understand the paperwork, but old enough to feel the shame pressing down on their mother's back. She hadn't planned to buy anyone. She just wanted a roof, a patch of land to call her own, somewhere nobody would throw her out again. But then they brought him out, Jonah Bell, the mountain man, with the heavy beard and the bound wrists. His shirt was torn at the collar. He didn't look angry, just tired, like a man who had carried too much for too long and finally let it fall. The auctioneer called him a drifter, said he had debts, said a man like that could be useful for chores if kept in check. No one bid, until Clara raised her hand. She didn't know why, not exactly. Maybe it was the way he didn't meet anyone's eyes. Or maybe it was the way he did meet hers just once, like he recognized something in her that others didn't. $1, she said. The crowd turned. Someone snickered, but the bid held. When they unshackled him and handed her the deed, Jonah didn't speak. He just walked behind her in silence, as if the dust knew where to settle now. She led him to the wagon, lifted her children one by one into the back. He didn't offer to help, but he didn't turn away either. She took the reins, and as they rode out past the last brick of town, the baby kicked in her belly, not hard, just a nudge, as if asking, "Is this it? Is this where we start again?" She whispered, "Maybe." And from the back of the wagon, a low voice spoke her name, Clara. She froze. The voice came from Jonah, but they'd never been introduced. What does he know? And how? The wagon creaked across the ridge trail, heading toward a half-rotted shack that someone once called a homestead. The door hung crooked. The windows blinked with dust. But it had 4 walls, and it was theirs now. Clara didn't speak of the name. Not yet. She helped the children down, unhitched the mule, set the kettle to boil. All the while aware of him, Jonah, standing off to the side like a post left behind after the fence was gone. She wanted to ask, how did he know her name? Where had they met? Had they? But words sometimes come too fast when you're afraid of the answer. So she said nothing. That evening she gave him a bowl of beans and a hunk of bread. He nodded, took it quietly, sat near the door with his back against the frame, as if he couldn't yet sit at a table. The children watched him. Evan asked, "Is he going to stay here?" Clara knelt beside him and said, "For now." Noli placed her doll on the floor beside Jonah. He didn't smile, just looked at it, a quiet kind of seeing, and nodded once. That was enough for her. The moon rose early. The wind had teeth. Jonah didn't ask for a blanket. Clara gave him one anyway. It was near midnight when she finally broke the silence. You said my name. He didn't open his eyes. Just said 7 years ago. You gave me bread outside a jailhouse. Thought I forgot, didn't you? She stared. I was starving, he said. Didn't ask for it, but you gave it anyway. She remembered, faintly, a boy no older than 20, eyes bruised from too many nights awake. She'd only been passing through then, still married, still hopeful. You said thank you, she whispered, and disappeared. He turned his face toward the firelight. Didn't forget. Some things stay. She didn't know what to do with that, with being remembered like that. So she sat, across from him, not close, but not far. And in the quiet, something passed between them. Not yet warmth, but not cold either. Just two people who had carried their pasts long enough to finally set them down, if only for the night. What else did he remember, and what else was she willing to ask? By the third morning, the roof leaked. Not in a wild, violent way, just slow drips in the corner, like the house itself had grown tired of holding everything in. Clara found a bucket and placed it under the wet spot without a word. She didn't ask Jonah to fix it. She didn't ask him for anything. She didn't have to. By dusk, he was on the roof with a strip of canvas and some salvaged nails. She watched from the yard while Evan gathered sticks and Noli played in the dust. Jonah worked steady, quiet, like a man familiar with damage. But the stillness couldn't hold. Not when the grocer refused to extend her credit. Not when the preacher's wife gave her children day-old bread wrapped in pity. Not when the man from town, the one who used to ride out when her husband was alive, came again. He didn't knock, just leaned against the post and said, "You can't just keep buying your troubles, Clara." She stood in the doorway, one hand behind her back holding the small knife she used for peeling carrots. Not to use, just to remember she still could. "I didn't buy him," she said quietly. "I bought space. Is that what you call it now?" From the field, Jonah walked up. Didn't speak, just stood behind her, arms loose at his sides, face unreadable. The man looked at him at the height, the roughness, the unbent kind of stillness, and left without another word. That night, Clara washed clothes by lamplight, her hands raw. Jonah sat by the hearth, sharpening a tool that didn't need sharpening. "You're not afraid of much," she said. He didn't look up, just used to being feared. And then after a long pause, "That's not a good thing." The fire popped. Noli stirred in her sleep. "There's no good thing in being alone too long," she said. "Makes you forget what gentle sounds like." She didn't mean for it to land heavy, but it did. Jonah didn't reply, not with words, but he stood, fetched her a towel, and hung the damp clothes without being asked. Small things, quiet things. But in a world that often demanded noise to prove worth, it felt like mercy. What happens when two quiet souls begin to make room for one another? It rained for 3 days after that. The kind of rain that softened everything, even the dust hardened by grief. Jonah stayed, chopping wood, remending the fence, holding Evan's arms steady when the boy tried to lift a bucket too big for his age. Clara noticed, though she said little. The quiet between them changed. Not warmer, just less brittle. One morning when she dropped the flour tin and knelt to gather the mess, he was already beside her. Not to judge, not to fix, just there. They both stayed crouched on the floor, the dust of white clinging to their fingers. And for the first time since she buried her husband, Clara laughed, only once, barely a breath. But Jonah looked at her like it was a sound he hadn't heard in a decade and maybe hadn't known he missed. Later that week, Noli crawled into Jonah's lap without asking. He froze, then slowly wrapped his arm around her shoulders, like the gesture wasn't meant for anyone to see. That evening, Clara brought out the quilt her mother had made, torn from time, faded from use. She laid it across the porch rail and said, "If you're staying, you ought to sleep inside." Jonah stared at her. "I mean," she added, eyes still on the quilt, "the barn's warm, but it doesn't feel right anymore, having you out there." It wasn't a question, and she didn't wait for his answer. But that night he laid his bedroll near the hearth, and in the dark when Clara passed with her candle, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. His boots placed side by the door, like someone who planned to stay. When the walls come down, can what's left still hold them up? They never talked about love. That kind of thing didn't fit well in houses like theirs, where the walls were patched with old cloth and hands had too much memory in them. But something had shifted. One morning, Clara caught Jonah whittling in the yard, the boy Evan beside him, watching the blade move. A carved horse emerged, slow and patient. No one said it was for Evan, but the boy slept with it that night. And Noli stopped asking about when Papa's coming back. Instead, she asked if Mr. Jonah knew how to make pancakes. That Sunday after chores were done, Clara surprised herself. She took out her sewing the dress she never finished, the one she'd started before her husband passed when the baby in her belly was still just a flutter. She worked quietly by the window, but Jonah noticed. Knew, he asked. No, she said, but I'm not afraid to wear it anymore. That night when the fire had dwindled and the kids were asleep, Clara stepped out onto the porch. Jonah followed, same as always. But this time she didn't sit far from him. She sat beside him. There was silence, the good kind. Not hiding, not heavy. Then he spoke, voice soft. I knew your name because I once saw you in town. Years back. You were carrying Noli. And you were smiling like you didn't owe the world anything. She turned slowly. I remember that day too, she said. You were the only one who didn't look away. When silence stops being a shield and becomes a door, who dares to open it? They came on a Tuesday. Two men in dark coats and louder boots than necessary. One carried a ledger, the other a pistol on his hip, not drawn, just there like a promise. Said they were from the mine company, that Jonah had skipped his bond, that he was still a marked man. Clara stood in the doorway with flour on her palms, her youngest tied to her hip. He's under my roof, she said. That makes him my concern. The shorter man sneered. Don't matter whose roof. Paper says he belongs to us. Jonah didn't flinch. He stepped forward, hands open. I paid my debt. The taller man unfolded the page, shook it once like truth needed noise. Not in full. The children were watching from behind the curtains. Clara knew what fear looked like in a child's face. She'd seen it in the mirror too long. She walked past Jonah out onto the step. You want someone to drag back in chains, she said. Then take me too. 'Cause I bought him fair. For $1, yes. But he's repaid me in work and water and watching my kids sleep through the night without fear. The men didn't answer. Only the wind moved, tugging at the corners of the paper. Then Evan came outside holding the carved horse. He carved this, he said. For me. Men who hurt people don't carve horses. The taller man looked at the boy, then at Jonah, then at his own boots. No one said okay. They just walked away, the page left behind in the dirt. Clara picked it up, tore it once, then again. Let the pieces fly like birds. When the world comes knocking with old debts and threats, will you still choose to stay? Summer came late that year. The rains were long and the fields slower to green, but when the sun finally stretched wide across the plains, it felt like something had forgiven them. Clara found herself humming again. Just little pieces of tune while folding clothes, stirring beans, brushing tangled hair out of Josie's curls. There was peace in rhythm, in the way small hands reached for hers without hesitation. In the way Jonah now slept indoors instead of out near the barn. He still rose early, still didn't say much, but he repaired the roof. Built shelves for the children's books, planted marigolds along the fence. Yellow keeps snakes away, he'd said. Maybe bad memories too, Clara had whispered. One evening, the four of them sat on the porch with slices of apple and warm tin mugs. Josie curled up against her, half asleep. Evan leaned against Jonah's leg like he'd always been allowed. And Clara, rocking gentle in her chair, looked at the sky and thought how far they'd all come. You ever think about leaving, she asked. Jonah looked up. Used to, not anymore. Why not? He shrugged. A man knows when he's been given more than he lost. She didn't answer. Just reached out slow and easy and laid her hand over his on the railing. There was no wedding band, no big declarations, just the sound of wind in the wheat and a woman who'd stopped running. And a man who didn't want to fix her, just stay. Sometimes the biggest miracle isn't being saved. It's being seen and still chosen. Sometimes healing doesn't look like a grand gesture. It looks like a man patching a roof beside two children who have learned to laugh again. It looks like a woman stirring soup while humming a tune she thought she'd forgotten. It looks like quiet hands passing a blanket, a door held open, a name spoken without fear. In the end, she never asked him why he remembered her, and he never asked her to explain the years that had broken her spirit. Because some things, when spoken out loud, become smaller than the weight they once carried. So they let the silence be their story, and the days that followed became their peace. A ranch that once echoed with loss now held the soft rhythm of new beginnings, the sound of two children chasing sunbeams, the warm scrape of wood under the dinner table, the wind pressing gently against shutters that no longer had to hold back storms alone. Life in its gentlest form had returned, not loudly, not perfectly, but truly. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the quiet power of being seen, of being chosen, not in spite of your past, but because of it, then maybe it's time to tell us, would you like to hear another story like this? Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply tell us what part stayed with you. And if these stories bring warmth to your day, subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, where love arrives quietly and always chooses to stay.